Ahoy there, YouTube. Welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be narrowing it down a bit and staying in one spring and looking for a very specific species of native fish, the Gulf Coast Pygmy Sunfish. Now you might be thinking, that sounds like a boring fish. Well, you'd be wrong, because this is one of the most beautiful fish I've ever seen. In all of my diving, I've seen some pretty amazing freshwater and marine fish species. And this is still a top tier fish, but I'll let you guys be the judge of that. I'm gonna get suited up and I'm gonna start out with the wide angle lens and explore around the spring a little bit and try and find the fish because it's only about a couple centimeters long. And once we do find it, I'll pull out the macro lens and we'll get some close-up shots. Hope you guys enjoy the video. I'll see you out there. I don't always take the time to do this in the mornings, but it's about 34 degrees today, so we were prepared this time. Got some hot water heated up in the hydro flask. We had steam. That's a good stuff right there. And this is an open cell wetsuit. So if you know anything about wetsuits, open cell, it's like putting on like a giant suction cup, and it has to be wet in order to fit on your body. Otherwise it's like impossible to get on. So, but if you add a little of this hot water in there, swish it around. Oh man, close it up better than that. And then swish it around. And all lubed up and ready to slip into. I really need to do it more often. It's definitely worth taking the time to do it. As I hopped into the water, it was like I landed in an underwater field lined with cows, except these were manatees, resting in the morning sunlight. The frigid temperatures had brought them into the thermal refuge of the spring. It might feel cold on a hot summer day, but in the wintertime, the year-round 72 degrees Fahrenheit water feels pretty nice compared to the cool air, and it's warm enough to protect the manatees from life-threatening cold stress. There wasn't much to eat in the spring, but a few of the manatees were still attempting to pick through the algae with their prehensile lips. I couldn't help but notice that some of the manatees seemed kind of skinny. Usually when they rest on the bottom, their plump bodies fill all the way into the spring floor, but some of them had huge gaps between their bellies and the sand. It doesn't help that there's no submerged aquatic vegetation in the spring for them to eat. Every now and then, the manatees would rise up from their slumber to the surface to breathe, the movement stirring up the sediment, sending a school of fish into a flurry of action as they fed on tiny invertebrates and plant material beneath them. The manatees may be hungry, but they are at least safe from the cold thanks to the spring. I made my way carefully through the sleepy manatees and kicked off toward the head spring. Although I was sad to see no aquatic vegetation, I have to admit the way the morning sunbeams illuminated the translucent algae was pretty spectacular. The floor of the spring was just glowing radioactive green, in stark contrast to the deep blue of the spring. It was honestly beautiful, but you can't let a beautiful sight fool you. This should all be native leafy plants and grasses. After cruising above the algae fields, I made my way up and over the head spring, where crystal clear water bubbles up out of the ground below, spitting bits of sand and shell out as the water rushes past the rocks and tree trunk that line the bottom. This spring isn't that deep, maybe a bit less than 20 feet. I took a quick breath and dove down a little ways, looking up at the reflection on the surface of the water. The branches of a fallen tree overhanging the vent were cloaked in algae, almost looking like a fuzzy underwater bush made of green pipe cleaners. Although there was plenty of algae to be found in the spring, it was still less than I've seen at others, and I began to poke around for signs of vegetation. Sure enough, at the edge of the bowl surrounding the head spring, a few plants were holding on. They are there, eager to reclaim the spring if given the chance, but sadly held back by overuse and groundwater contamination, slowly choked out by all the algae. The crystal blue waters are mesmerizing, but it's important to look beneath that surface beauty to see the full story of these ecosystems in order to better protect them. I still, of course, had to dive down and play around a bit in the spring. By late morning, the manatees began to move on out of the spring, and I started to look around to see who else was hanging out in the area. First off, I came across this juvenile Florida gar, hanging out by itself in the spring. The way the sun shone through its tail made a tiny rainbow as it swam in circles around me. There are also plenty of largemouth bass. This fellow in particular was pretty curious and came right up to me. Most of the others, however, were pretty busy poking about in the algae looking for food and didn't pay much attention to me. Not long after, I came across a very colorful red-breast sunfish surrounded by mullet. It's a beautiful fish, but much bigger and actually less vibrant than the one we're ultimately looking for today. A spotted sucker was also working the spring floor close by. These guys suck their prey from their spring floor into their protractable mouths, which is pretty cool. At first glance, this shot may look like nothing, but if you look closely, there's a flat little hog choker camouflaged into the sand. And to top it off, one of my favorite fish, a bowfin, swam out from the algae and up through a school of sunfish and bass, all part of the diverse ecosystem of Florida's freshwater springs. But it was time to get down to business. I have a tiny fish to find, and the search is on. I knew that I'd be most likely to find the pygmy sunfish on the edge of the spring, so that's where I started. I took my dive light and methodically began making my way around the edge of the spring, looking into every crack and crevice I could. Although they were super cool, the small alcoves and caves at the edge of the spring were not giving me what I wanted, so I had to switch up tactics. I needed to start looking at the vegetation along the edge. There was a huge mat of algae that looked promising, and it was cool how the light shined down through the top, but I still didn't turn up anything in there. I was beginning to get a little worried I wouldn't find the fish, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. A little loggerhead musk turtle darted out from under a small clump of algae and quickly disappeared. Cool find, but again, not a pygmy sunfish. In one of the tiny caves, I saw this medium-sized species of sunfish that was dark blue, but still not the fish we were looking for. As I pushed further into the edge of the spring, little clouds of algae came alive with tiny fish. While none of them were pygmy sunfish, this was a good sign. Red-eyed chub and bluefin killifish were darting around all over the place. I was in the right spot, it was just a matter of time. All of a sudden, my eye caught a flash of blue. It was so small and quick, I was almost second-guessing myself if I'd actually seen it at all, but I knew I had seen something. But then, not far off in the distance, I saw another flicker of blue. I had found them. That fish disappeared in the algae, but not far away, my dive lights illuminated a tiny fluorescent black and blue jewel. I was so excited, I just sat there and watched as it flickered and shined in the beam of my light. I'd finally found the Gulf Coast Pygmy Sunfish. But by this point, I had been swimming all around the spring, and I got a calf cramp. These are not fun to get ever, but especially not while swimming when you kind of need your legs to not drown. But thankfully it wasn't too deep, and with a little massaging, I was able to work it out. But it was time to head in and switch camera lenses. Well, I finally found them. I did almost one complete loop without seeing any of them. And then finally saw one. And then on the next loops, I started seeing them all over the place. There are plenty of them out there. They just gotta know what you're looking for. But once I got a good search image, man, they just keep popping up everywhere. I stand by what I said. Top tier fish. They are just cosmically colored. All right, switching to macro lens now. With the macro lens on, I was ready to go. Keep in mind, most of these shots up ahead are handheld at 100 millimeters, but anyways, here we go. The little sunfish were shy at first and kept ducking out of frame behind algae clouds. But with a great deal of patience, windows of opportunity began to open up, and I was able to see what I still hold is one of the most beautiful fish I have ever seen. The colors were deep black and iridescent blue that honestly made me think of deep outer space. The colors on the fish seemed to pulsate as they flitted about in the shallows. Although they look like a miniature version of standard sunfish, like we saw earlier in the video, there's some debate about whether pygmy sunfish are actually true sunfish. A lot of scientists classify them in their own little subfamily. There are only 7 species of pygmy sunfish, all somewhat similar in appearance and located in the southeastern US. Although there was very limited native vegetation in the spring, the pygmy sunfish seem to have made themselves quite at home in the algae. These fish have tiny territories that they defend furiously. A territory is usually not much bigger than a cubic foot. Males will guard these tiny areas from rivals and intruders as they wait for a female to come in and nest. Eggs are deposited on the organic matter in the territory and soon hatch out and disperse, for the process to happen all over again. These territories have verticality to them, so you have to think three-dimensional, and the sunfish would regularly poke through the thick algae to access different parts of their tiny kingdoms. As they worked to defend their territories and attract a mate, the male sunfish would color up, shifting quickly from translucent and blue to the most brilliant dark black and blue I'd ever seen. They would also wave and flap their fins, flashing the vibrant colors at intruders and potential mates. So far, all the individuals I was seeing were males, as the females lack blue coloration. However, there were a few young males in the area that did not appear to have well-established territories, and were out looking to claim tiny aquatic lands of their own. But this is not a task that would go unchallenged. A fully colored up dominant male quickly emerged, forcefully escorting the submissive male out of its territory. Occasionally dashing aggressively at it. The young male was persistent, however, and didn't give up easily. But the dominant male was not to be intimidated and helped swim the little guy to the edge of its territory. Better luck next time, pal. You'll get him someday. Rival males aren't the only challenge the sunfish face. The shallow edge of the spring is home to an abundance of life, and other tiny fish have their territories and young to defend as well. Namely, the bluefin killifish. Males have incredible blue fins with splashes of orange and/or red on their stomach and tail. They would dash about the shallows, busy with their own squabbles between themselves, but in this video, we're here for the pygmy sunfish. And although the killifish mostly were passing through the sunfish territories, oblivious to their issues, our outer space colored furies were not going to let these trespassers slide. The sunfish were constantly on a swivel, immediately locking in on any intruding killifish. They would suddenly jet off, dashing at the perceived threat with incredible speed. It was pretty thrilling to watch this tiny drama unfold underwater. At this point, my attention shifted to an individual whose colors weren't really all that bright. He was hiding in an algae cloud, keeping a watchful eye on the world around him, but he seemed almost timid to me at first, keeping well within the dense filaments of algae. A group of mollies and what I think are red-eyed chub came dangerously close to his territory, and I was curious if this little guy would summon the courage to ward off these intruders. It was a rapid, subtle change, but his colors darkened almost out of nowhere, and I watched as he shot up to the top of the algae to scare off an invading minnow. There was more to this little guy than I had thought. As I continued to watch him patrol his territory, his colors grew even darker to the point where he was almost no longer recognizable compared to what he looked like 5 minutes ago. And I promise, this is the exact same fish I just showed you. And as the intruders came circling back, he was ready. So I set up my camera on my tripod and sat back and watched these tiny battles unfold. At this point, an actual full-blown sunfish showed up. And you might think that its size would scare off the pygmy sunfish, but not this guy. He dashed straight at the large intruder, unfortunately just outside the frame, but leaving a trail of bubbles in his wake. He even dropped down below the algae cloud and carefully warded off the larger sunfish, flashing his cosmic colors furiously. He may be small, but let me tell you, there's nothing pygmy about this fish's spirit. I took a few last glimpses at the sunfish. I've been diving Florida Springs for years, and making this video was actually my first time ever seeing them in the wild. These freshwater ecosystems are full of surprises, and I was reminded of why it's so important that we protect these unique aquatic habitats that, in spite of the challenges they face, provide refuge and home for such a diverse and colorful array of wildlife. Even still, it was time to peel my eyeballs away from my camera and leave this tiny world of the Gulf Coast Pygmy Sunfish. Truly a top-tier fish that looks like it's from outer space.
That was a good day. I was a little worried I wouldn't be able to find him, but I found plenty of them.
That's just one of many reasons why I love Florida Springs, because even though they may not be the biggest ecosystems, they still provide habitat for megafauna and then amazing tiny creatures just like Gulf Coast Pygmy Sunfish. So, but I've been in the water all day, well, not all day, but most of the day. So, I'm pretty hungry. I'm gonna go get some food. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.